Hello, good morning. This is a Retinawesome channel. We're going to be talking about the second part of the Retinawesome meeting that happened last December 5th. That was great, and many participants from around the world. We discussed retinal cases, and especially vitreoretinal surgery. So keeping going on with our presentations, and I will show you a case from Dr. Lam, very interesting one, and then we're going to discuss it. And so let me share my screen.
The jam or anything, we are just doing blindly. I was worried not to. Yeah.
The ultrasound was persistent fetal vasculature, and
so Dr. Lam is gonna talk about persistent fetal vasculature. Very interesting lecture.
So this was sent to me by one of my pediatric ophthalmologist colleagues, and she had this a very young baby, is about 2-3 months old, with the a very noticeable fibrovascular plaque behind the lens, and so normally she would have looked after the anterior PBL, and she was quite concerned with this case. And like most of the PFE cases, you should do a good preoperative assessment. And so the ultrasound basically showed there's a thin stalk, and there wasn't too much pathology noticed. So this case was relatively straightforward to manage. So I just want to highlight a few kind of pointer. Because I couldn't see it behind it, even though the ultrasound was very good for the anterior part, I was taking a more cautious route, so I decided to go through the limbus instead of go through the pars plana. And after the mastectomy, it's very helpful to cauterize all those prominent vascular lentis vessels, those prominent vessels on this fibrovascular plaque, because when you cut into this plaque, they will otherwise hemorrhage and bleed and could make the surgery difficult. And second point is that scissors is more preferable than the cutter in terms of cutting these types of membrane. And you can see the membrane itself is quite thick, and there's organized vitreous behind it. And that's probably part of the vitreous pathology that's associated with these kind of cases. And then you can use bimanual approaches, but so happen that I can manage it single-handedly. And on this side, you can see I decided to use bimanual. And second aspect of the surgical technique that one needs to take caution is not to pull that membrane too much. Sometimes you feel like you want to see things very clear, and you pull very firmly on it and pull quite a lot on this. And that's tractions on the cerebral processes. If you pull too hard, you actually can either cause some bleeding there, or you can even, in some extent, causes cerebral detachment. So even though you may want to be able to see very well, and by pulling it, try to separate the membrane further so that you can identify the tractional point, but it's probably better to be somewhat gentle. And then you can switch to the cover to remove the membrane, and you can the fibrous crack in the center. can also easily be removed with the cover. And I'm just going to move this along. So I just want to show you at the very end. I didn't want to cut out the entire piece because I didn't want it to fall into the back. So I left part of it still attached, and then using the cutter to remove the rest of this membrane. And at the very end, there's still a little piece behind. The second thing that you have to do is to cauterize that anterior hilar vessel that leads into this fibrovascular plaque. And that's important because during the surgery, with the increased intraocular pressure from the infusion of the fluid and also the epinephrine that you add into the fluid, the vessel may look very avascular, but don't let that fool you. And that's important to cauterize it and trim it. And then you can trim that residual membrane that I have left behind. And one rule also, remember, is don't be too aggressive, because there's no real advantage to cut it all the way, including the cerebral body, because sometimes you can actually, again, accidentally cut into the cerebral body and cause injury and cause bleeding. It's important to do a peripheral scleral depression because very often they do have abnormal peripheral retinal pathology, because sometimes they do have this anterior tractions and draw the retina anteriorly. So it's important to make sure that there's nothing abnormal in the periphery and there's no edge and genic break. And I just want to show you the second case. This is quite different from the last case. You can see I already have to use iris retractor, and this preoperatively showed significant pathology, and you will very quickly see that. And in fact, there's also what we suspected pre-existing detachment. And the membrane is thick, and after removing it using alternating scissors and the cutter, and you can also see the vitreous is quite organized, quite thick. And I want you to see near tropical clot. I hope you were able to show with the scleral depression that there is a pre-existing retinal fold, and I think that may be responsible for the detachment that was associated with these conditions. So see if I can move this along the way. So I'm just trying to
Dr. Lam.
Yes.
Saad is asking what are the parameters, the settings for the cutter during these procedures.
It's the same as I normally do. This is a 5,000 cut, and vacuum was also similar to what we normally do, was 350. I didn't change the setting necessary for the children cases. So you can see there's a thick stop, yes?
I meant because the membrane usually are very thick. Do you usually increase the vacuum and decrease the cut rate? Would that help, or it doesn't make a difference?
No, I normally don't necessarily change the setting much for that. And so here you go. So here's the fold that I was mentioning, and that was concerned, and you can see there's an opening there. Now, I don't know whether it was pre-existing or it happened from the time of the surgery, and that's where the pathology is. So you can see the hyaloid, you can see the retinal fold, the detachment was likely pre-existed, and there's a retinal fluid there. And so I went ahead to continue with the retractomy. I'm just going to move to the next slide. And so continuing doing the surgery, and end up after completing the vitrectomy, I added the peripheral carbon fluid because there was no other brick that I can identify other than anterior brick. And so the peripheral carbon fluid was injected here. You can see the interface is there. I continue to do the vitrectomy because with the peripheral primary fluid added, the retina has become more stable. They allow you to continue doing the vitrectomy without creating too much tractions and elevations on the retina. And I just want to show you at the very end here is the interface of the fluid. And when we were looking into the anterior part of the retina, that retinal fold that was seen in the early part of the surgery has smoothed it out and become this spot where it was seen. There you go. So here's the depression. That area, that fold that was originally seen has already smoothed out. So I decided just put an anterior band and treat that area and fill the eye up with silicone oil in this particular case. So just going back to Sar's questions, I normally don't necessarily change unless the membrane is very, very thick, then that membrane, I was able to manage it with the original setting. So I don't routinely readjust the setting just to cut the membrane. And maybe we can ask Yoshi Harold, see whether he does it any differently. Do you adjust your setting when you have the PFB cases?
I think, well, first of all, thank you so much for all the pearls for the PFV cases. They can be very challenging. And at the American Academy of Ophthalmology this year, the whole pediatric retina panel discussion was about PFV. So there's many ways that you can do it. I personally really like the way you did it with the scissors. I think the pearls here were that in the beginning, the first case, there was no view to the back. So you entered through the limbus, which I think is key. Because as you mentioned, sometimes the retina can be very anteriorized into the pars plana, and you can nick that if you go through the pars like we normally do, even if the B scan looks good. And here you approached it with the scissors starting in the periphery. And I tend to be a little shy and afraid of the peripheral pathology, so I tend to start in the middle with an MVR blade to create an initial plane and use the cutter on a low cut rate to kind of debulk the membrane from inside to out. But Dr. Lam, I think your technique is better because you could just more cleanly cut everything and you're not pulling on the peripheral ciliary processes as much. So I think next time I would approach it like you did.
Yeah, I think this particular case happened to a very thick central plaque, and approach it with the MVR centrally may be tough. And also, I was worried about the vessels behind it, and we may inadvertently cut the vessel and cause premature bleeding that I may have some issue of controlling it. I was cutting in between the plaque, the central plaque, and the ciliary processes. I thought that was relatively safe. I found scissors helpful. And to answer Zad's questions too, when you have a membrane, it's much easier to eat it with a cutter from the edges inward. As long as you have it edged, then you can eat it because it's a guillotine cutter. It's very hard to try to eat it from the top or from the bottom. And in this case, you have to approach the membrane from the side. So you can feed that membrane into the cutting port. You should be able to debulk it, and you don't necessarily have to change the setting.
All right, and Emmanuel, would like to ask Dr. Lam?
Waiting, beautiful cases, let me clear myself. I consider myself lucky. I don't do pediatric VR, so no comments on the case, but beautiful videos, fantastic technique. I admire your patience and your organization. I love the AC maintained reversal during the time that you were dealing with the membrane in anterior chamber, so you kept the chamber stable. And I am grateful that you people exist, and you know, children and babies and parents can be happy and you do your best. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And moving forward, very interesting case by Dr. Lam, showing in that first case where he had this membrane in the at the pupillary level there, and kind of fibrotic, and it was kind of tough to remove it with the cutter, but as he discussed with Yoshihiro Yonekawa, his approach was from the peripheral to the center, and debulking the membrane with the cutter without pulling too much or causing traction to the ciliary body, because otherwise it would damage, you know, the anterior segment structures. And he, with his approach around the fibrous tissue, he could well release it, debulk it, and then he left a little bit before coming to the posterior segment. And at the posterior segment, the first thing that he did that was interesting, he used the cautery to cauterize that vessel that created all these fibrotic tissue, fibrovascular tissue, and that was important. Even though the vessel looked like closed, he mentioned that we should always pay attention to that, and we take just a few more minutes and to cauterize it. It's better to avoid the bleeding and hemorrhage in the post-operative period. And then he removed the rest of the anterior membrane that was in the anterior segment that remained, and it was possible to go on with the case, doing the vitrectomy, and the media was already clear, the retina was attached, and of course he did indentation to take a very good look at the retinal periphery, and that was awesome, very good case. And the other case, a different case, because we had these epiretinal tissue, the folds that probably caused the retinal detachment, and he managed with the good settings, as Saad asked about the setting. So he would go on with 5,000 cuts per minute and remove the fibrovascular tissue in the anterior segment as well. And then at the posterior pole, when everything was released, he got a view from the posterior pole. He did this vitrectomy, but the retina was all attached. So he removed the epiretinal folds and epiretinal tissue, and then used the PFO to flatten the retina towards the retina, the posterior pole. And then after that, he was able to carry on with the case. He put a band, and then since the retina was attached, he ended the case with silicone oil. So these pediatric cases are like if you watch the meeting from the very beginning, you're going to see that Yoshihiro Yonekawa's cases on pediatric vitreoretinopathy, we got to be very careful with the retina, especially in these pediatric cases, because you see the retinas are very friable sometimes, and you got to be extra careful not to cause a hole or a break at the posterior pole, otherwise the case would end soon, will be finished before even you had a chance to finish your surgery. So you got to be very careful. In this second case, the retina was already detached, so the only way to go was to attach it without creating the holes or breaks in the retinal center. And then with the silicone oil, perfluorocarbon liquids, and after switching the PFC for silicone oil, and then you would have the retina attached. And of course, to improve the likelihood of having the retina attached, he used this anterior segment band, and with the band, things usually settle down in these pediatric cases, even though we think they will not, but most of the cases they settle down. The RPE pump, as Yoshihiro commented in his keynote lecture, that works pretty well. So different approaches, and from these two cases from Dr. Lam from Retinawesome 007. And I thank you very much. We're going to come up with more cases later on. And thank you very much for watching. Bye.